I can't remember who I was speaking to about the days where you're talked at as opposed to spoken with, right? Um, we'll move progressively into this being a dialogue. But the next thing that I kind of want to go through is about emotional intelligence. Who here has been through an opening or through a restaurant job where they've told you emotional intelligence is important to you? No, that's depressing. So emotional intelligence to me, all right, so where am I going to go with this one? All right, so I would say that like I started with the bones of these seminars probably around 2 decades ago. And so what I would say has changed, because I have changed in how I've approached what happens in a restaurant, is that there was a time period where I was focused on how you did something and not how somebody was receiving it for a long period of time, which I don't think I was alone. I think it was an industry sort of situation, right? Like many years ago, I would focus more on the tabletop and how I felt like steps were occurring, as opposed to how people were engaging with the experience overall. And I think that that was a time period where the focal point was definitely on service more and technique more than it was on hospitality. It was just a different time. And then what changed is, generations start to come up and things start to shift. So we moved away from what was long considered luxury, which was a very prescribed way of doing things, where you had a script. That script was rarely diverged from. And the idea was that you were creating, a very clear structure to the experience, to it becoming about the guest looking for less consistency and relaxation into known elements, and it became more about experiential travel, hospitality. Things became more about how people walked away from them than they did about the uniformity of the experience, which is why you see that in today's day and age, the spaces that tend to suffer are the chain restaurants. And in a space like Portland, you can see the things that people seek out here are the things that feel very specific to Portland, right? We live in a city in which it's very clear that there's a huge proportion of people who come into the city as transients, as guests of the city. And their focal point is on trying to discern things that are very unique to their surroundings, right? So that changed, right? And from that, I would say there became a focal point on the individual and how they took away from things, right? And so my perspective changed. I think a lot of globally our perspectives changed, and it became less about rigidly saying and doing the exact same thing than about making sure that people were enjoying themselves inside the spaces, which, by the way, I think is the right move. I think it's the right pivot if we're doing justice to the fact that it's humans who are inside our space. I have always, or not always, I have in that period, since this industry shifted, been concerned with a couple of ways that we look at things, which is that even inside restaurants, we often lose the individual for the group. So we'll refer to table 22 or the 4-top or the 2-top, as opposed to thinking of there being actual humans who are there who all are walking away with different impressions from one another, right? And so that's why I think it's very important for us to not get lost into this group think of thinking about what's happening to a table, and instead paying attention to the people who are at that table. So how do we pay attention to them? We pay attention to them through our ability to be open to the signals that they're sending us. Okay, so there's different ways that people can send us signals. One is non-verbally, right? So if I sit at a table and I am not making eye contact with you when I'm sitting at that table, would that lead you to believe that I might not have a ton of openness or be 100% trusting? Perhaps, right? Might be a safe assumption to say something's going on with that person where they won't make eye contact. We make eye contact typically because of the fact that we feel comfortable and confident with ourselves and with the audience that is receiving the conversation, right? So when there's a lack of that, it can be that there's a lack of trust involved, right? If I am moving my body away from you or not facing you, it can mean that I don't trust the process as well, right? That I'm protecting myself. So one of those things that I always tell people, has anybody heard of the term a vestigial trait? You have? Great. I appreciate that. Most of you did not raise your hand, so I'm going to spoil. I'm not going to put you on the spot that you have to explain it to everybody. But basically, vestigial traits are inherited traits. They are things that are passed along, often behavioral, that we learn generation to generation from being human, right? So there are some things that universally we learn from one another, okay? One of which is, let's say I walk around and I cross my arms, okay? When I cross my arms, the reason that I cross my arms, which every one of us does it universally, we feel comfortable crossing our arms. It's what we do in unknown situations or when we don't know exactly what's coming towards us. The reason why we do that is because of the fact that the soft organs of our body are in our abdomen, okay? So the space that is most exposed and most vulnerable from us is said abdomen, right? So when we cross our arms, it is a self-protect mechanism. It is something that takes literally the weakest, most vulnerable portions of our body and makes them feel comforted, right? So generations and generations and generations ago, when we had to think about actually surviving predators, right? This was an instinctual thing that we did in unknown circumstances to protect ourselves, right? For survival. Now, we inherit it so that we walk into a conversation with somebody that we don't randomly know. We cross our arms because of the fact that it makes us feel more comfortable, right? And literally what you can find, which I think is funny that it has happened, is that in this room, since I crossed my arms, several of you have subsequently crossed your arms. And if you look down, you can see if you're one of those people, but it is a natural reaction. When you are gauging, you are looking at me and I am telling you that I don't feel comfortable with you or something that's happening. And so you are responding with the exact same level of discomfort because of the fact that you're taking that away from me without registering it. So naturally, this is something that we do. And you can do this in a group of your friends. You could stand around, if you're in a circle with people, cross your arms, watch. It's like dominoes, right? One after the other does it because we are reading each other subtly all the time. The thing that's different in this industry is that we are reading each other to an end. This isn't us subconsciously reading people. This is us consciously reading the behaviors of the people around us in order to be successful in a number of different circumstances. So I was just having a chat before we went into this session. And one of the things that I brought up is that we're verbalizing a lot of things that are not verbalized in general at this industry, right? I brought up previously that there has been considered in service, which represents comprehensively both back of the house and front of the house. I want to say that. Like when I say service as a craft, it is not singularly either or any singular position, right? Service was considered a craft, and it was considered a noble craft for many years. It was a place that people often would pull their families out of poverty in order to be able to rise to that next level, even in societies where class mobility was unattainable, right? So you have TV series like Downton Abbey or things like this that like play into a lot of that lineage, which is something that all of you are doing inside the space. We in the modern day have lost a lot of this historical thread, and the fact that for thousands of years people have caretaken for one another, and it was considered a craft as opposed to considered to be part-time work that we were just biding time with, or work that supported creative pursuits or flexibility, etc. So there's a lot of historical precedence in that, right? And there's often not accorded to you all the same sort of respect, because it's not outlined all the things that you do that are deeper level when you are going about and engaging your jobs. One of which is, for those of you who are engaging with guests, it is amateur psychology and therapy, right? So when you walk up to a table, you'll hear this tomorrow when I speak to you, I would often force, or I would tell my team, you have to greet your table. It can't be someone else. There were always plan Bs and circumstances where somebody else would greet yours, but I had to like sound harsh about doing it in order for people to get the meaning behind it, which is that you, David, could decide to give away opening a bottle of wine for a table, and that will not affect the overall table. But, however, if Natalie gives away greeting her table and I greet the table, that is my time. That is the first time that they're receiving somebody inside the space. And that is the first time that they are being assessed, in which they're giving a ton of nonverbal information that allows us to decide how to continue going back up to them over and over again, right? So if they won't make eye contact, it means that something has happened, that they don't trust the process. If bodies are turned away from me, it means that I can't guarantee that they're receiving the information that I'm giving them. If they're not making eye contact with one another, or there's smiles that aren't occurring tableside, it could mean that there was some sort of conflict or issue that occurred before they walked into the space. There's a lot of things. Maybe one person feels very shut down and very removed, and one person is very eager and engaged in the process. That means that I have to work towards the person who is uncomfortable and gearing it towards them, instead of speaking singularly to the easy person to interact with, right? So that over time, I'm breaking down that barrier and they feel comfortable. I'm assessing all of those things when I first walk up to a table. So if I'm a manager, right? And the reason why I said with David is that if he's opening that bottle of wine, nobody cares who's opening the bottle of wine, right? There's nothing that's going to better me from being the one who was present when that particular step was there, or from marking a table with a fork and a knife, right? However, when I first walk up to the table, that could be where I'm assessing all of these important things that allow me to know how to walk up to that table every other time following that, and how to see whether I'm succeeding throughout the course of the event or not. The other thing that's dangerous is that, let's say a manager swoops in and saves your station and is greeting every single table. How many people have felt that energy when a guest is looking at the manager and not at you because of the fact that they were the ones who greeted them first, right? And you just seem like you're the B team who's coming in to take care of them. It's like whoever greets that table first is the point person, right? And so after that, you're working double time to try and recoup that energy of them connecting with you, right? So it's one of those scenarios where we look at moments of engagement that are more important for us to be present versus less. I use this analogy to the managers last week when we met with them. I'm going to give you a scenario that occurred when I was training somebody who's now very successful in this industry. At that time, she was a manager who started in like the first rotation, which was a breakfast manager shift at a restaurant that I was leading. It was Jean-Georges, so there was a formal dining room a component that was fairly regimented. And if you were a breakfast manager, you would start in the casual dining room, and then eventually you would be trained in the more formal space, right? And so I was training her in this formalized space, and as she was walking through it, we didn't do a lot of conversation. We didn't draw attention to ourselves really inside that dining room. And so often the time for question and answer would be when we did a circle through, we did a lap through, and then we came out, then she'd be able to ask questions. So I walk through, and mind you, this is a person who's very competent, who's very capable, who is following me. And we went through together, and we left the room, and her first question was, I could tell that you were upset with what was going on inside the room. What was happening that you saw, okay? So I'm gonna give a scenario because I think often people are treated like they are more junior than they are, and roles are degraded into being more junior than they are. What I like to think servers are, or bartenders are, is they are managers of a responsibility that, or a station that is very finite and controlled, right? It's often why when we're first sitting down and we're drawing out a floor plan, we're thinking, the way that I always think when I'm figuring out where a station boundaries might be, is how could I have a server stand in the center of the station and see all of their tables or all of their guests? That is a good station, right? Because I can make eye contact with everyone. If something's hidden from me, it becomes more dangerous, right? So those are the sorts of things that we start to think about, right? But, so in this scenario, what I expressed is, in that formal dining room that I was describing before, it was a little bit more complicated than the service that we'll have here, definitely more formal, which I would never do nowadays because it bores me to tears. But what you would have is you would have a captain. It's a French brigade system. So there's different systems that have existed for years. Some people's ears light up to this, Colin, because we've lived in this for 2 decades or whatever the hell they are. But in a French brigade system, you have a captain who is followed by a front server, who is followed by a back server inside a station, okay? And so what that means is that captain is the manager and the ultimate kind of supervisor of that station at a higher level. The front server is doing all the tactical work, the marking of tables, the dropping of glassware, the pouring of wine, stepping in when that captain cannot, right, empowered to do so, but keeping the efficiency going. And then that back server is the one who's maintaining everything, right? Water levels, bread levels, clearing, setting down cutlery if necessary if the front server can't. So that's kind of the station, right? So this particular station of 5 tables had 1 table that was empty, that could be set for 4. 1 table that was a default table of 6, I believe on this day, it was a table of 8, okay? So a larger table, right? Then a smaller table for 3, and then 2 tables for 2 that both sat on a banquette. One catty corner, so both people were kind of sitting across from one another, not across from one another, but side looking out, so they both had views of the room, but they weren't forced to look directly out in the room with not having any visual relationship with one another. And then one table in which they were side by side, looking directly out. Okay, so inside this room, there was a group of 8 people chatting it up at that large table that I had described, having a conversation, fully invested in each other, okay? The table of 3 that I had mentioned was 3 business people who were having conversation with one another, but it was very like surface, right? Like chit chat sort of conversation. They were clearly in for some sort of business lunch, and then at some point they were planning on leaving. Like it was a very functional purpose why they were all there. The table of 2 that was seated so that they were both looking out at the room, but not directly side by side with one another, had a glass of champagne in front of each of them, and they were having a lot of conversation, smiling easily, looking out at the room, having a conversation over things. Menus were closed. They weren't focused on an order right away because they were clearly there to have an experience and enjoy themselves, either for a celebration or because they were into it, whatever it was. And then there were 2 gentlemen. For 14 years, I worked with French people, so I can say this. There were 2 Frenchmen who were there, who were probably in their 70s, and were uncomfortable sitting side by side, and so were dead silent, just looking out at the room. Okay? So this captain that I saw was walking from this table for 2 that I had outlined was enjoying themselves and there for a special occasion and there to live it up for the day, and then over to the table for 8, right? And so in my mind, I'm like, this person already isn't in control of their station. Reasoning being, there's a clear timetable with those 3 people. They're nice right now, but they have an end time, clearly. There's only so long that this little polite chit-chat is going to last for them before they need to move to the next stage of whatever. Then there's this table of 2 where these men, regardless of what I think about this scenario, are uncomfortable sitting side by side with one another. So they are in a space where, are they unhappy? Are they upset? I know in a restaurant, the worst scenario is you have 2 people who are sitting with each other and totally ignoring each other, dead silent, no facial expression. In that scenario, what I would tell you, lessons that I have learned, are that you fill that either with conversation with them, food, or beverage. Something's got to fill the space because that is not fun, whatever's happening at that table, right? You can trust your eyes sometimes, okay? So what I see is 2 people who might be getting more progressively upset, or at least aren't engaging with each other. 3 people who at any point could say, I need to order and get out of here, right? And I see the captain going to 2 people who might keep you for a long time to have a conversation because they're just enjoying themselves and they got nowhere to be, right? And then a party of 8, and a party of 8, realistically, can take 30 seconds or it can take 10 minutes to get away from them, right? So I'm thinking this person doesn't have a strong strategy about how they're going to maintain control over what's in front of them. Does that make sense to everybody? But it takes reading each of those tables and each of those people to be like, these people are good. They're having a great time. I don't need to worry about them. These people, they're going to take a lot of my time. So for me, what I always tell people is if you got a larger table, table 6, table of 8, go, every time you go up to that larger table, visit all of the smaller tables to be able to engage with them. Same way, for example, let's say Colin comes into this dining room. Everybody knows Colin. Colin is somebody who is going to get an outsized amount of attention because of the fact that people want to impress him. They know that he works for the group. They want him to enjoy himself. So he is going to get a VIP level of treatment, regardless of if he says or asks for it, right? Internally, it just will happen because people will know him and want to engage with him. If you have a table of employees who are clearly getting a different experience or a known experience or feel like they're being taken care of, then in my mind, I am giving extra attention to all of the tables that are watching Colin's table because I know that in their mind, they're already feeling like they're not as important as Colin's table, right? So for me, if somebody can view that one singular table and not just in that station, then I'm going to take extra care of them. I'm going to stop off extra more. I'm going to do these things to offset some of that feeling that maybe somebody else in the room might be more special than you are, right? So it's thinking about things this way, right? Where I'm looking at the deeper level of how somebody is receiving something. Does that make sense to everybody? But it's being available to pick up that level of information to then be able to discern how you're going to go about running your station, right? Or how we care for people. It's the same thing if somebody goes into a recovery mode. So emotional intelligence is being attuned to the fact that, and this is something that we talked on earlier, your version of what's important is not necessarily what someone else's. You, David, might not care which table you're sitting at or where you're located inside the restaurant. However, you might feel like you are neglected if you're thrown in the back of the dining room. It might feel like you got the worst table in the house, right? And it's very difficult to predict where somebody feels the best table and the worst table in the house are. And you often find out about it only when you seat them at the table that they convince themselves is the worst table, right? So it's being able to receive those things when people go down. So I'm going to give an example of what can go wrong in the guest experience and why we need to not make things smaller, we need to make them bigger. So I come in, I'm greeted at the front door. I had made the reservation ahead of time. I said that I wanted to go to a window seat, and I specified that it's somebody's birthday. They've never been here. I'm hosting them. I care very much for this other person, and I want it to be perfect, so I'm putting a lot of pressure on the situation. A host walks me over there to that table, which is not a window table. So immediately I'm caught off guard, and I'm defensive, and I said, actually, I requested that we were at the window. That host politely excuses themselves and goes up to the host stand to check and see if there's any alternatives for where I've been sat. Meanwhile, I have not sat down. I'm standing, right? I'm standing at two seats that I don't like in the middle of a dining room next to someone that I'm trying to impress. And I am progressively getting more and more uneasy as things are going on because I don't know. They didn't say, sure, we can show you right this way. I'm waiting, and I might find out that it's not an option, right? So the host comes back. They tell me, yes, I can move you over here. And in their mind, that host says, I solved the problem, right? So it's no longer a problem. However, I've already gone into a space where I'm defensive and I'm on edge. So I haven't forgotten that I went to a weird table and then I had to go to another. Even though I'm happier that I'm going over to this new table, it still is something that's in my mind, right? That because that host thinks I solved the problem, that host doesn't pass it on to anybody else. And so ultimately, now, a server doesn't know that something has happened with this guest, right? And approaches them as they would anywhere else, right? In this particular circumstance, the server's busy, sees that the table got sat, And because of the fact that they haven't been brought to their attention that these guests are there, they take, let's say, 15 seconds too longer to get over to the table than they typically would because they're busy, right? Justifiable things that are coming up. They're not being lazy. They're just doing other things. So then I have gone from a table that I was unhappy with to a table that I'm happy with. But now I see David, Natalie, I see Gregory, I see a bunch of people walking past me. And I don't say to myself, David has a different station. Natalie's a bartender. Gregory's working across the room. All I see is people in uniform who are ignoring me while they're walking in front of me, right? So in this industry, oftentimes you'll find that a lot of the surveys where people complain about things that occur, they'll often say, I was sitting at the table for like 10 minutes before somebody greeted me. It's never 10 minutes, I can promise you that. It's usually like 2 minutes, but it feels like an eternity when you're sitting at a table and you don't know who there is. Remember I told you there's another point of orientation issue? It's when you first sit down at a table because you don't know who's going to help you, right? So it's another weak spot in the guest experience. But so I'm sitting there too long, and now as a server, I walk up to this table and I'm not on edge because of the fact that I don't know anything that's gone on. So I greet them casually, right? And I get their drink order. And then I walk away from the table, at which point I tell my busser to water the table, that they want ice water. And the busser walks over to the table, pours water into each of the glasses and accidentally spills onto the top center of the table, right? Then grabs the serviette, wipes up the mess, makes sure that the table's clean. However, he doesn't know that they had a problem with sitting down. He doesn't know that they waited longer than we would have thought was acceptable. And none of this information is making it down the line, right? So now that's 3 things that have occurred, right? So then drinks come up at the bar, right? Those drinks come up at the bar, and at this point, I'm too slammed. I can't get to them. So Gregory is managing the floor, and Gregory goes and grabs the drinks, and he accidentally, because I was rushing when I was ringing them in, I rang them in the wrong seat numbers. So he goes and drops them off, and he drops them off to the wrong seat numbers. And because he's not hyper vigilant because it wasn't his table, he walks away from them. And we have to move the drinks to the person who was supposed to get the drinks ourselves, right? So I'm painting a picture for you, but you can see how it could continue on, right? The guest, in my experience, personal experience, who freaks out inside a restaurant setting is not the one who you spill soup on, which I have done inside a restaurant setting, nor the one that you drop a drink onto, which I have done in a restaurant setting. Just to let everybody know, we said those mistakes things. Let's all be honest about the mistakes that we've made during the time that we've been doing this, right? So it's not those people who freak out. Those are the ones who are compassionate because of the fact that we feel terrible, they feel surprised by it, but they see how much we're trying to help them and eventually it subsides. It's the guest where it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? It's feeling like everybody in this room didn't prioritize them, right? And so what I would say to you, especially as we open, everything should be considered a big thing. Not just what you would consider a big thing, because like we said, you might not care which table you're sitting at. You might be meeting somebody and you might be having a conversation with them for a long period of time, and you might not care that somebody takes 15 extra seconds to come over to your table and greet you. You might not care that somebody drops off drinks to the wrong seats. We can't get into the space where we can know with the humans who are sitting across us what they think is important versus we think is important. That is an unknowable until you are able to demonstrate telepathic skills, in which case I will give you multiple shifts and help you out however you'd like, because that would be incredibly helpful. But the truth of the matter is that we have to assume that what is small is big to prevent something going awry. And so what I would say to you is even small things, even if it's something stupid that nobody cares about, if you're verbalizing that to the people who are going to be taking care, that team and the manager who is taking care of those guests, it will be a benefit for us because at least we will have avoided underestimating what a problem would be. Because it's the same problem, the same issue that we had when we were talking about judging a guest's decisions, right? That you so articulated earlier before, right? Is that there's a real danger in that, in us, in judging other human beings and being like, well, they want ketchup with their steak, so they suck, right? Or, whatever else it might be, right? Instead, it's important for us to understand that there's a real problem with relativism, where if we say, that's not a big deal, right? Like, it's easy to say a ton of things are not a big deal, right? It's a slippery slope. And you can't understand the person who's receiving something across from you. So it is important that for us inside this restaurant, even small things are big, because that will allow us to not allow somebody to leave unhappy from the space. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. What that requires us to do is to be attuned to other people, right? And pay attention to them. Now, when we talk about emotional intelligence, there's ways in which we are on the back foot about it, and we are in a defensive position, most of what I've just described to you. And there's ways in which we can get the guests to work for us, and you can take control of the situation. For example, who here has waited on a large party, let's say above 4 before, and that party will not shut up? Raise your hand. Okay, so it could be several couples, maybe they all had kids, maybe they have somebody taking care of said children for the first time, so it's the first night, parents gone wild on the town or whatever it is, right? And these people are just chatting it up left and right, okay? If you are passive in a scenario with them, they could talk for 40 minutes and not break a sweat because of the fact that this is exciting, new, and fun for them to be able to get outside the house and have adult conversation again that is not stemmed around their child, right? That being said, if you are passive, that larger party is the first party that will flag down a manager and say, I've been here for 45 minutes and we don't have any appetizers on the table and we don't have our drinks yet, right? So they're going to hold you accountable for the expectations that they have. They're not expecting in their head that they have to manage their own time. Their expectation is you're managing their time. So what I would suggest is when you get into larger parties, what I will always do is I'll size up the group. You know this trick. And whenever you're sizing up the group, you find the weak one.
I hope you're still looking around.
And you look at the weak one and you smile at them because they make eye contact with you and they don't stop making eye contact with you. And you just sit there awkwardly maintaining a pleasant smile until they start getting the rest of the table to shut up around them so that you can get a word in edgewise, right? So there's ways that we can get our guests to work for us using emotional intelligence in the same way that we are trying to discern where there may be potholes and speed bumps that might occur throughout that experience when we're engaging with them. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Emotional intelligence also comes into play a lot when we see people escalating their responses. So there is a slippery scale where we start losing people, and they start getting more and more defensive and concerned that you are going to fulfill your end of the bargain, okay? So an example of this could be, who here has gotten frustrated when you call someone for customer service and you keep on being routed to another person and another system instead of somebody who can resolve your problem? Raise your hand if you've had that experience. Okay? Because I'm an emotional child personally, not professionally, but personally, it is very easy for me to turn into a lunatic on a phone when I cannot get a hold of somebody who's going to take care of me. And so each progressive conversation, I get more and more irritated and more confrontational because of the fact that I have less and less faith that I'm going to be taken care of. And I'm more and more annoyed that I am spending more time on resolving whatever situation I need help on, right? So I'm amping myself up and then directing that energy to the opposite side of the phone, okay? The guests who come in, who are freaking out, who are verbally engaged with you and seem like they are incredibly intense, it would be natural, because each of us has a fight or flight mechanism inside of us, right? Like we talked about earlier, for us to disregard the person based on the way that they engage with us, right? And write them off as evil or terrible or good or bad. The problem with life is that very few people fit into clear definitions of malicious or positive. And many of us, if you live long enough in this planet, you'll find yourself live long enough to be a villain, which is absolutely true in some scenario, and humbling in life. But what I would say is that it's important to understand that what that person is saying to you is exactly what I'm saying when I start yelling at the person across the phone from me, right? Rationally, I recognize that I'm a crazy person by screaming into my phone, but I no longer care, because now I just need my needs met and I no longer trust that it's going to get taken care of. That is the same thing that the person inside the restaurant is giving you as information and feedback. They are saying, I don't trust this process and I don't trust you to be my advocate, right? And so what they do is they amp up their emotional response to demand that their baseline of what they consider to be necessary to caretake them is met, right? If I, let's say, walk over to Natalie's table and she's called somebody over to say that her steak is undercooked, right? If I walk over to that table and I say to her, we can easily take that steak up to the correct temperature. Let me take that away from you. I might not seem like I take it seriously. I might not seem like I am invested enough. And she might still be in a space where she's amped up emotionally. And so my lack of reaction is not going to de-escalate the amount of adrenaline that's going through her body, right? If instead I say to her, I'm terribly sorry. I apologize for that. I know that our chef would happily bring that up to the correct temperature. Let me take that over to him. I'll make sure it comes out very quickly. I'll be right back. And again, I'm so sorry, right? If I move towards her projecting emotion, which not all of us do naturally. Some of us are more monotone. Some of us are more internal. Some of us are less externally emotive. One of the things that we have to learn in this industry is projecting what our intention is to the person who's across from us. And so I might feel, if I'm somebody who's more internal and more monotone in my delivery, it might feel a little bit over the top for me at first, what I need to do in order to convey that to that person that I'm invested. But again, what I'm looking to demonstrate to Natalie is I take it more seriously than you, so you can relax. You don't need to worry about being taken care of, because I am horrified that we got here too. And with that, she'll settle back into her table, right? And I would say one of the things to keep in mind, which is again the fight or flight response that I tell people often, in a hospitality setting, there are many times where your gut instinct is one that you will ignore. And I don't mean your gut instinct as to how to resolve situations, conflict management, things like that, but you will be driven by that same fight or flight instinct. And it is important to understand that it won't always be to your benefit. Who here has waited on a table that a table had an issue? The issue had to go into the kitchen for resolution, and you felt uncomfortable going back to the table without the plate of food that they needed resolved. Raise your hand if you've felt that before. Okay? I have as well. Some of you are liars. We're not. So ultimately, what I think is important to recognize is that in walking, if I feel uncomfortable without having something in my hand going back to that table, it could be appealing for me to go and stand in the kitchen and wait for food, which there's this thing that's accurate, which is that your eyes will not cook the food faster than whatever apparatus is going on inside the kitchen setting. But we feel like we have more control in that setting, and we feel like we don't want to walk into a scenario where we don't have what's needed to finish this and to resolve it, right? If I go and hide into the kitchen and wait for that food to be ready, that guest who's over at the table knows that you're avoiding them. They know that someone is not coming there. And if I stay away from them, I will make them more agitated than less agitated. Whereas if I've dropped the food off to the kitchen, there's been a ticket that's made so that the chef can clearly send it into anyone's hands to come back. If a manager is aware of checking by the table as soon as that food comes out, I should feel comfortable walking back to those guests and apologizing to them and having a conversation with them as human beings, right? If they treat them like a human, it's going to de-escalate things. If I show them that I'm afraid of them and avoiding them, then I'm not on their side. Again, the same thing that I was demonstrating through the way that I was engaging with Natalie about that steak, my absence will completely counteract that if I don't rush in to fill that void. What I said before to everybody who was here, your dangerous scenario is when there's nothing to fill a void, where people are just on edge and they're not engaging with each other and there's no one there to fill that gap. The options are that it gets filled with food, that it gets filled with beverage, or it gets filled with conversation, and you're the one to trigger that conversation. So that food's not coming right away. The beverage will only come if I have a conversation with people and find out if they want something else to increase, right? And in the end, it's going to be my physical presence that camouflages the mistake that's occurred and bridges and papers over that gap until that food comes to that table. Does that make sense to everyone who's here? And the same thing is true in a lot of different scenarios where we might feel the urge to avoid something is when we should address it, okay? And conversely, when we might feel agitated or in that fight phase, like when a guest is rude and says, is demanding to us or is amping up their behavior, that fight reflex is unhelpful, right? Because we're not recognizing that there's something that's motivating them being amped up. And we've never met them before, so it has nothing to do with us, right? It could be that they had a terrible day before they came in. It could be the life experiences that have occurred. It could be that there's all sorts of extenuating circumstances that happened before they walked in through those doors that has nothing to do with us. So why take it on emotionally? And why be frustrated with it? You know? So there's that little bit of separating ourselves emotionally from the stimulus in front of us that we could do well with if we're going to walk out of the scenario successfully. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. One of the things that's important in order to be emotionally intelligent and to be able to decide strategically how you're going to do things, which I would want for everybody in this room, whether you're running a station in the kitchen, whether you're running a station at the bar, whether you're running a 5-table section, whether you are responsible for food running, or whether you're responsible for clearing and setting tables. I would want you to remain in charge of the situation. So you have 2 nervous systems, your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system, okay? One relies on that fight or flight reflex that we had discussed before, right? Where a lot of it is based on movement, energy, and survival skills, okay? When things go to that space, you will rarely be in control, okay? So how many people have in a restaurant felt like a chaotic shift where everybody's losing everything and it just feels like the energy's off for the entire room, right? We've all been there. So I can remember, because this happens everywhere. It happens in informal spaces. It happens in like a neighborhood joint. It happens in a 3 Michelin starred restaurant. I can remember when I would lead shifts at John George that I would feel the wheels start to shake, right? You can sense it. You can see people's movements becoming more erratic, people being more rushed, people duplicating steps because they're moving and not thinking, right? People bumping into each other accidentally, right? What I would always start to do is slow myself down. When you feel like you're losing it, in some circumstances, the best thing that you can do is you can slow your body down to pull yourself out of this reactive state, right? Because chances are, most of us know, don't move your body in a direction that your head isn't facing, right? But when you're ping-ponging from tasks because you feel like you're in a state of desperation, sometimes that's just what you do, right? And subsequently, that might be that time that you drop a drink on a guest, or that you spill soup, or you bump into somebody else, right? Or food drops because of the fact that you weren't able to pay attention to the fact that it's there. I often used to pull captains outside of the room, and I used to stand with them and annoy them, by the way. They were very annoyed by this. But I would sit with them and count to 10 before I would let them back in the room. And maybe things were falling apart in their station, but I'd rather that they were able to control themselves, because half of what a guest sees is what you give to them, right? I have certainly been in a number of dining settings where I have dealt with a server who is very busy, who is talking to me, but I can see them looking around the room and not making eye contact with me. And I know that they are frantic, right? And there's other responsibilities that I have. I might empathize with them, but my standards for what I'm hoping for start sliding down the scale, where I'm just looking to get in and out of there in the correct amount of time, because I know that things are not going 100% the way that they're supposed to go, right? So it's up to us to pull ourselves back away from that automatic nervous system response and being motivated and fueled by adrenaline and propelled by movement into a space where I'm able to analyze what the steps that I want to do are next. You'll hear often in this industry, and I'm sure you've heard it before, consolidate your steps. Why do steps get consolidated? So that your life is easier, so that you're not running ragged, so that things happen more efficiently, so that you can put time with your guests, right? One of the things that I think is important in this circumstance is to think about how I can't begin to consolidate my steps unless I'm clearly thinking and taking a step back and deciding what the next 10 steps are going to be. So what you can also do to catch yourself is, if you find yourself solely and singly thinking about one next thing that you're going to do, that might be a sign that you are overwhelmed and you need to slow the process down, right? But awareness is half the battle. Us getting into a space where we're aware of where we're losing the plot is half of what we need to do. So as I said to you before, those staff members in spaces that I would walk into who are missing guest eye contact, who are trying to flag them down, it wasn't because they were unknowledgeable, unintelligent, unhelpful, or uncaring. It was because they were propelled through motion and missing a lot of what was going on around them. So our goal is to constantly be grounding ourselves to be able to see all of that so that we're seeing the person who's trying to make eye contact with us. Because years ago, like I said, as opposed to focusing on people at the table and how they were enjoying themselves, you would focus in on the tabletop and whether it was clean, or whether it was maintained, whether there was any garbage on the top of the table, or whether the settings were pristine, and whether there was empty glasses on the table. That meant success years ago when you were only focusing on service. And that's not what we're looking to do. If we had to choose one over the other, hospitality would be more important than simply service. Does that make sense to everyone? The most important thing, because you can have also at a tabletop, you can have 4 people who love things and 1 person who doesn't. And I hate to tell you this, but the majority of humans on this planet are passive aggressive. And they will not use their words to tell you when something is wrong. Instead, they will just be resentful of you for the fact that you didn't read their mind and somehow fix it, despite the fact that you don't have all of the information available to you. So it's just important for us to recognize that there's certain things that we have to do in order to be able to pull and extrapolate information and get them to verbalize things when they might not be so inclined to do so. Does that make sense to everybody? Let me just see how long I've done. Okay, so one of the things that I think is important is for you just to sit and think about times that you've lost control in a restaurant, which is probably every single person who's here, and times that you've felt in control at a restaurant. We would want you to feel in control at all times. We would want you to feel like you were the one who was deciding what you're doing and not somebody who is at the end of the night feeling completely unsuccessful because of the fact that you had been overwhelmed the entire shift. And it takes all of us to be able to start to recognize when we go in that direction to prevent it in the future. And in the end, inside this space, there will be a lot of people who can help you, who can support you. There will be managers who are here. There will be colleagues that are here. There's a lot of different things, different layers that we could use as support. But it's much more difficult for people to support us if we can't verbalize what we need from them. And you have to have a sense of awareness in order to be able to do so. Does that make sense to everybody who's here? Okay. So emotional intelligence is knowing ourselves and when we start getting consumed, as well as our guests, it's being more aware of ourselves. You don't have to stand like you're in the military, but if I'm leaning on a table and I'm not paying attention or making eye contact with my guests, that could be, I've personally have a lot of friends who are no longer in the industry, who years ago, I either worked alongside them or I managed them. And they would always come to me and they would always complain about the fact that the guest wasn't taking them seriously. And I would sometimes think, well, that's because you don't take this job seriously. I know you really well and you don't like what you're doing, so I know that you're not taking it seriously. It's about us recognizing how seriously we take ourselves and how we portray ourselves is picked up subconsciously by the people who are sitting at that table and then used as ammunition as to how they choose to engage with us. So you seeming like the expert and engaged and intent and available to them diffuses a lot of them running you ragged by constantly batting at you and demanding things from you, right? So there's certain things that we can do to offset some of the less pleasant experiences that we've been through in this industry. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, same as last time, different victims. Any thoughts that you had from this particular conversation?
Just like focusing on treating your
customers very well, more of the hospitality than service, like you said.
Hmm. So being attuned to them and how they're receiving everything that you're doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just focusing on their attitude and reading their body language.
100%. It's helpful, right? And it's not always obvious to us. What about for you?
Nina.
Nina? Hi, Nina.
Hi. Don't hide in the kitchen when things go wrong.
Yeah, it's tempting, but it doesn't really solve anything. And I know that it's provoked a few explosions in my time. So sometimes the best way to diffuse something is to place yourself into it and to have a conversation with guests.
Andrew, yeah, it feels good to talk about this because definitely caught myself needing to take 5 seconds to just collect myself and think that through. But in the moment, the last thing you want to do is stall it for 5 seconds. But it feels good to hear that.
Yeah, sometimes you do need to slow down your body in order to be able to pull yourself out of a reflexive, reactive way of engaging. And in general, there's two different approaches, right? There's a proactive approach and there's a reactive approach, right? Proactive approach typically implies that you are in control of the situation and you are anticipating something before it comes to you. A reactive approach implies that something occurs that then you have to react to, right? And so in general, the more that we can do to put ourselves into a proactive mindset is going to benefit us because of the fact that it means inherently or in an implied way that we're in control of the situation, right? Whereas if we're just operating off of reactions to stimulus in front of us, then chances are we are not in control of the situation. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any questions that anybody has? Going once, going twice? Okay. All right, so today's conversations have been about service and hospitality and how they relate to us and how they relate to what we do. They have been about emotional intelligence and how that emotional intelligence can be applied towards other people and also towards ourselves and our own flaws and shortcomings, right? Which takes a lot of effort to be aware of these things, right? And be honest about them. And so let's start thinking about ways that this can apply throughout the training process, right? And especially as you go throughout doing, when we're going through not only the role-playing sessions that we'll have, but particularly through mock services where we're going through live engagement with tables, it would be ideal for us to think about how we might pull ourselves out of this reactive way of engaging and recognize that we need to slow ourselves down and start adopting the behavior that we'd want when we first walk into a live restaurant scenario. Does that make sense?
I have a question.
Yeah.
The scenario that you mentioned in the beginning, could you just go through the ideal way that we would kind of respond to the people being seated and the place they didn't request, just the pointers of how we would respond to that?
Yeah, that's actually a great question because I didn't give you as much that, which is helpful. Okay, so let's say I took you to a table and you were unhappy with it. I would say, I'm so sorry. Let me check and see if I can move you somewhere else. You're more than welcome to stay here, or you could follow me. You're totally wherever you feel most comfortable. Let me look and see if I can take you over to a place that you prefer. And again, I apologize for this. Number one, rationing up my emotional engagement with them so they know I'm on their side, so it diffuses that a little bit. I'm giving the option that they could stay there. I would also offer up, if you want to sit down so you're more comfortable, so you're not just standing, feel free. That doesn't mean that you're going to stay at this, but at least it allows you to feel more comfortable while I go and find out if there's an alternative. So I would give them options so that they feel like they're in more control of the situation. You could stay here, you could sit down, you could follow me, whatever you feel more comfortable with doing. I'm going to go and do my best to make sure that I take you to the place that you'd like to be, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. That was a really good question because I did not give the answer for that, which is not very helpful.
so we're kind of like insatiable by nature, but and they knew that. They just kind of were like, yeah, totally. Even though they're like, look at this guy, he's just asking to go from one end to the other. So just grace, yeah, just handling things with grace. But
And maybe listening a little bit deeper. Sometimes we go into emotion. Sometimes, here's the other thing with problem solving. Till we fully absorb the problem and listen to it, we could not come up with the right answer because we're so quick to try and get the problem off of our list or resolve it that we have not actually fixed anything. So in that same sense, your different space, same problem, right? Whereas if I had been really listening to you, I might have addressed that and said, unfortunately, the only other seat that's available is on the exact opposite side, so it's the same thing, right?
But then I thought with that, then they might be kind of like a little, what's the word, not patronizing me, by being like, well, you're just gonna sit at the other end of the same bar. So I
Fair
think it's
enough.
Grace, and they were very like, yeah, and they accommodated. They kind of played the part.
Good.
But then I
Good.
realized I was like, I just asked to sit at the other end of the same bar. So.
Well, then they fooled you into doing what they wanted of you, so they did that even better. So I'm not going to criticize how they handled it. So, which would be in the end what we're all looking to do, right? Get everybody to follow the rules that we want them to follow while thinking that it's their own free will, right? So good scenario. Any other questions or thoughts?
This one's not.
Oh, well, do you want to go first? Yeah, you're closest to me, and then I'll come over to you.
This one's kind of silly because I did work for a French guy too, and they introduced me to this rule regarding diction. When you're addressing the group, they didn't want us to use guys. They said use folks if you have to. Do you have any kind of diction guidelines following?
I don't like to say either word.
Yeah.
I like to say you all or to you, as in plural.
Mhm.
One of the things that I would take further than that I think is, again, a table thing that and this is not something that I took away from working for somebody French or from anything recently. I think it's important to make eye contact evenly with every single person. And if I'm doing things that are specific to an individual, let's say taking an order, delivering food, delivering drinks, etc., I'm going to stand next to that person and move around the table as opposed to standing at one position and expecting that everybody cranes their necks or moves around me. My goal would be that people see that I'm taking care of each of them equally. And so I'll set that drink down and then I'll move to the next one and then I'll move to the next one and then I'll move to the next one, as opposed to what would be easier for me if I just set these across the table for each other, because what I'm looking to convey is that I'm taking care of individuals and not the group. Does that make sense? Yeah. So like a little bit of an extension of that, but spot on.
So something you mentioned briefly when engaging with guests, I might have written it down, but I think you call them like minor therapy sessions, which I took as like nurturing someone through an experience. And I was just kind of curious about, I know you said you had a couple follow-up things about that, and I was just curious about what you kind of meant by like, making it more personal for them or for you, or just like giving or like, I don't know, I guess I was just kind of curious about.
A scenario about how you might adapt to the people at the table? Okay, so some people are cold, naturally. Half of my family is Mexican, half of my family is German, so culturally, stereotypes, they sit on opposite ends of the spectrum. What I would say is that some people are cold when you first engage with them, okay? If somebody is cold to me and not immediately engaging, that would be a table that I wouldn't delegate the bottle of wine to somebody else. I would try and be present for as many interactions tableside, whether it was delivering drinks, watering the table, marking the table, setting the food down. I would try and be there as much as possible, because sometimes what breaks down that barrier is not necessarily my emotional engagement, but my consistency. And over time, seeing the same face over and over again and having me hit the marks that they're expecting makes them feel more comfortable and puts them more at ease, so that that barrier is one that's broken down through exposure, not through engagement. Does that make sense? So by the end of that meal, they feel comfortable with me because I'm the one who's done everything at that table. And I just might, in that scenario, tell my manager or my support staff to focus on other tables more, and I'll try and focus on this one, just because I'm trying to break down that layer of distance between me and that person. So that's an example of how I might choose to strategize based on what I'm receiving from someone and choose a route to get to a conclusion that I want to when it's not obvious in front of me. Does that make sense? Okay. Good questions. Yeah. Okay, great. What I'll do is I will let everyone be done with hearing my voice for today. So this is the last conversation that I'm going to have with you today. So winning for everybody who's here. What we're now going to do is a couple of things that are going to be led by Carrie. And then one of the things that she's going to look to do, which we will do subsequently every other day, is to make you very comfortable with what's happening in your future in the next couple of days, and specifically tomorrow. Okay? All right? Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'll take the applause. We're cruising through, years ago.